Greetings all, here we go. We're going to talk about reducing behavior without punishment this time. So this goes really closely with the lecture that I spoke about in the past with regard to punishment. Now I always said that this isn't my favorite option. That's because these things are here, and these are my favorite options for reducing behavior without punishment. Of course, some of them are a little bit more challenging than others, and we'll talk about the benefits and drawbacks of each as we go through. So here we go. All right, right off the bat, the first thing we got is extinction. Okay, this is probably the most effective behavior or tool at reducing behavior. Now, that said, there's problems with it. We've talked about those problems in the past. Extinction is literally, by definition, the withholding of reinforcement and/or reinforcers for previously reinforced behavior. So behavior that was currently under, that's been on some schedule of reinforcement, if you stop reinforcement for it, right, then you are immediately going to see an effect on behavior. Now, when I say immediately, of course it depends on what sort of schedule it was on, but oftentimes the extinction is going to produce a burst. Right? So with that extinction burst, the behavior is going to get worse before it gets better. But you know that if that behavior does get worse, if the behavior you're trying to extinguish increases in frequency or increases in intensity or something, one of those one of those behavioral categories, then you know you're doing the right thing. You know you've actually withheld the reinforcer and that the behavior is reacting accordingly. So over time, the behavior will reduce, but you have to be ready for it. You have to know that extinction is going to produce basically a side effect that you don't want as the person that's managing the behavior. The good news is that if you see it, that means you're doing the right thing, you've got the right procedure, and the behavior is eventually going to reduce. But of course, it is an eventually sort of scenario. Right? So as it goes away, it will start to steepen a little bit. The behavior will start to go away quicker and quicker as time goes on, and then it will eventually decrease to basically zero. And then we'll deal later on with spontaneous recovery and how, or resurgence, whichever one you want to look at, depending on if we're talking about classically conditioned or operantly conditioned behavior. We'll deal with that resurgence and see how the behavior will come back as well, even at kind of random times or delay times. It's not really random, but after a certain amount of delay. So a lot of people think ignoring is extinction. It may be. Sometimes ignoring is extinction, but there's no guarantee that that's the case. It could be that ignoring actually maintains a behavior. So they're not the same thing at the outset. You can use planned ignoring to possibly put extinction in place, but that assumes that the behavior is maintained through like a social reinforcer or attention or something like that. So by ignoring someone, you're removing that attention, and it is possible that the behavior will go on extinction. However, you're not 100% sure. So in order to know what it is that, what reinforcer it is you have to withhold, you should really do an FBA. And of course, in the real world, FBAs take time. They're not something that are quick, and as a result, you may have to be dealing with this behavior a lot quicker than what an FBA will allow you to deal with it. So sometimes you just make a guess. Okay, this is what I think is reinforcing this behavior, so I have control over this reinforcer, so I'm going to withhold it. As a result, hopefully, you pick the right thing and the behavior will start to decrease. So again, this is not a punishment scenario. You're not adding something. You're not really removing something in a specific sense. You're removing the reinforcers. You are not giving the reinforcer that was once given. So that's why we say withholding. It's not the removal of a stimulus or anything like that. I mean, I know we could technically define it as that, but the effect of extinction is dramatically different than the effect of, say, negative punishment, which is the reduction in behavior by the loss of a stimulus. This is quite a bit different than that, because you don't get that. In contrast to punishment, you don't get an immediate drop in behavior. Actually, it gets worse through that extinction burst before it gets better. But like I said, if you get that, then you know you're doing the right thing. Okay. So, what isn't extinction? It's not just ignoring. That could be a form of extinction, but it's not required. It's not a general decrease in behavior. It's a particular pattern of responding that decreases over time. And depending on the schedule that you had, or that the behavior was under, then the the shape of the extinction curve will look a little different. It's not forgetting. Forgetting is basically failing to perform a particular response after a given amount of time has passed. This has nothing to do with a given amount of time. And in fact, we'll talk later about resurgence and how time can actually increase the amount of resurgence that happens. Right? So it's not just forgetting. You're actually learning that this behavior is no longer being reinforced. It's not response blocking. Response blocking is when you actually prevent a response from occurring, which then, of course, prevents access to the reinforcer for the response that didn't occur. So this is not that. This is the blocking of that third term. You're not going to allow the reinforcement to happen. The behavior still happens. You're not going to touch the behavior. You're going to let the kid get out of line or whatever, and then you're going to put that on extinction. You say, you know what? No longer does that work. There's a lot of things that are really difficult to put on extinction, especially stuff that produces automatic reinforcement. So I suppose we could talk about that now a little bit. So the idea is, if a behavior produces an automatic reinforcer, and there's nothing that you can really do to control that reinforcer, then trying to put that behavior on extinction is futile. It's just not going to happen. You're not going to be able to get it on extinction because the reinforcement that's produced is automatic. And a good example of this is cigarette smoking. Cigarette smoking is a behavior in and to itself, but one of the reinforcers for cigarette smoking is the delivery of nicotine. So there's your positive reinforcer that's automatic. There's also a negative reinforcer, which is the reduction of withdrawal symptoms. You can't touch either one of those with extinction. I can't just tell you, okay, I'm no longer going to deliver the nicotine to you. That's not going to work, right? And you can't tell somebody, no longer am I going to remove those withdrawal symptoms from you. No, it's automatic. It's not something you have control over. So with regard to cigarette smoking, you can't put the actual behavior of smoking cigarettes on extinction for someone that is addicted to cigarettes. It won't work. It's impossible. So you have to choose a different behavior. One of the interventions that I've done in the past with several people has been to put the behavior of what do you call it? Cravings, right? The craving is an actual behavior. So if you put the craving behavior on extinction, the idea is that you won't follow that craving with a cigarette, and that eventually that will reduce the drug-seeking behavior, the cigarette-seeking behavior. It's also not non-contingent reinforcement. Non-contingent reinforcement is the delivery of reinforcers that has nothing to do with the behavior, right? So after you've identified a particular stimulus that reinforces a behavior, you could deliver that stimulus essentially at random times. And that has a function of actually decreasing the particular behavior in question, but it's not necessarily, and it was definitely not extinction, because you're actually delivering a reinforcer for a particular response. So when can you use extinction? Only in the situation if you know the reinforcer, right? So in a positive reinforcement situation, if you know what the reinforcer is through an FBA, then you can go ahead and, well, I guess I should say, you have to have access to controlling that reinforcer as well. If you can't control the reinforcer, there's no chance that you're going to be able to put the behavior on extinction. So be realistic with yourself. If it's something that you have access to and can control in the environment that you're in for the particular behavior in question, and that the reinforcement is not automatic or perfectly natural, I could say, then you're not going to be able to use extinction. Negative reinforcement is a more challenging situation, because negative reinforcement is the loss of a stimulus that produces a reinforcing situation. So how in the world do you extinguish the loss of a stimulus? Well, if you know what the loss is, if you know that, let's say, a behavior is maintained through escape, then you can prevent the person from escaping the environment. So let's say a kid gets asked to do some math, and then they typically throw a tantrum or something like that. Well, a tantrum is a particular behavior. The reinforcer for that tantrum, right, is the loss of the environment, escaping the particular task. So when you escape that task, then again you're getting negatively reinforced. So how would you extinguish that? Well, you would prevent the escape from the task. So go ahead, throw your tantrum, but I'm not going to let you get out of this room. You still have to produce the behavior. Right? Automatic reinforcement, very difficult to use extinction with this. Oftentimes, automatic reinforcement is through sensory reinforcers. So about the only thing you can do is mask it, if at all possible. Can you visually blind the person from a visual reinforcer? Can you give somebody some other, like a piece of candy or something that will mask the taste of something else that may be a reinforcer? Auditory, can you put earphones on or earplugs in? Kinesthetic, prevent movement, those types of things. So you get the idea. I mean, with automatic reinforcement, I tend to just say, you know what, from my perspective, in my experience, I'm not going to be somebody that's going to be very successful at tackling automatic reinforcement behaviors, or trying to extinguish behaviors that are automatically reinforced. I tend to think of things in alternative methods, like I said with the cigarette smoking. Cigarette smoking is obviously not kinesthetic, but it's what do you call it? A drug reinforcer, right? So it's working on a biological level, so that the biology is then going to produce the reinforcer. So how do you do that? You got to think about a different behavior. What is the behavior that led to that? And it isn't the smoking itself. Of course, that is what immediately produced the drug effect. But in general, you could put the behavior that led to smoking on extinction. So if you think about drug-seeking behavior, or the craving specifically. So if you put the craving on extinction, then it doesn't produce an automatic reinforcer. The craving is a behavior. It's that verbal response saying, I want a cigarette, or whatever it may be. And then you go out and you smoke the cigarette, which is another behavior. In a sense, it's a chain, right? So if you think of it that way, you can put that first link in the chain on extinction. So, but again, automatic reinforcement is brutal to try and deal with extinction. It's not instant, right? So extinction, as I said before, it's not going to happen immediately. It's going to take some time for it to occur. It's going to go through this extinction burst. So that's that possible increase initially, right? So that's the extinction burst. In my experience, I wouldn't say possible. I would say it's going to increase first. Right? The steepness and the magnitude of that extinction burst is going to be different. For different people, for different behaviors, for behaviors that are under different schedules of reinforcement. So each schedule of reinforcement produces a different, a different amount of resistance to extinction. Variable schedules are much more resistant to extinction than fixed schedules. Continuous schedule is hardly resistant to extinction at all. You might not even see an extinction burst, but you could, and I would expect it. After that, it tends to be a gradual decrease. It gets faster and faster as time goes on, and at the end it kind of tails off. And of course you can see plenty of examples of an extinction curve in your text, or of course you can bug me and I will provide a ugly hand-drawn version for you. All right, that burst that we've been talking about, that's an initial increase. Again, think of the kid in the candy store, right, or the grocery store. Kid starts throwing a tantrum. Right? Parent has decided that they went through this parenting class and they're going to put this behavior on extinction, but they forgot to learn their lesson about the extinction bursts. So they start to put the behavior on extinction. The kid's screaming for a toy, right? I want a toy, I want a toy, whatever they're saying. And then the parents are doing good, they're withholding, they're saying, nope, I'm sorry, not this time. We're not going to buy that toy today. And the kid gets worse and starts to throw a huge tantrum. So the kid starts throwing this huge tantrum, right? Then what happens? If the parent at that point believes that extinction is completely ineffective, they'll likely give in. Right? And now you just reinforce that behavior at a higher level. If you knew about extinction, if you learned your lesson about it, you would know that that temper tantrum is a sign that you're doing the right thing. The behavior's about ready to decrease. So it's going to go through that, it's going to switch from that initial increase into that gradual decrease at that point. So whatever you do, if you've got a behavior on extinction, for crying out loud, don't give in during the extinction burst, because it's only going to serve to increase that behavior, maintain that behavior at a higher level than what it was before. And not only that, you're also putting on some type of variable schedule, probably a variable ratio schedule. And when you do that, you're just producing a very strong, high rate of responding that's going to be extremely resistant to extinction. So expect that burst. It's going to be an increase in magnitude or amplitude of the behavior. It's also going to produce random behavior in a sense. It's going to produce variability in behavior. And that's just one of those effects of extinction. Kind of hinted at this a moment ago. Continuous reinforcement is hardly resistant to extinction at all. Think of it this way. if you've been continuously reinforced for behavior, if every behavior you engage in for one pick a behavior, if every time you engage in that behavior it's been reinforced, then the moment you go on extinction, you're going to know you're on extinction, right? So the behavior is going to start to drop away really quick, right? In other words, it's no longer being reinforced. On a fixed ratio or a fixed interval schedule, let's say you've got a fixed ratio of 5, so every 5 responses you're going to get a reinforcer. Now, when you put that behavior on extinction, the person isn't going to know they're on extinction until after they get past that 5th response. So it's going to take a little while before the person realizes that they're actually on extinction. Same thing with a fixed interval schedule. Now, variable schedules, depending on the ratio there, the variable ratio or the interval, how thick, how thin it is, the thinner these are, the more they're going to be resistant to extinction. Because the point is that you never know with a variable schedule when you're going to get reinforced or when you're not. And if you don't know when you're going to get reinforced, well, guess what? Your behavior will maintain for a long time. So as you might expect, as you go up in these curves, the CRF, the FR, the VR, so on and so forth, you're going to produce stronger extinction bursts, longer resistance to extinction. It's going to take longer for the behaviors to go away. Establishing operations tend to increase the resistance to extinction as well. You've increased the effectiveness of a reinforcer, so the organism, in a sense, is going to, the person is going to respond as if that reinforcer is a bigger reinforcer or there's more of it. So the behavior will become more resistant, and in a sense, it builds more momentum. Behavioral momentum is another one. History, right? So how long has that behavior been performed? The longer it's been performed, the more resistant to extinction it's going to be. Previous extinction trials is another one. Has it been through extinction before? Because each time you go through extinction, the extinction effect gets quicker and quicker. So the first time you go through extinction, you're going to get a big burst and it's going to decrease gradually. Later on, you're going to go through some resurgence and the behavior is going to come back, right? So when that behavior comes back, now you're going to put it on extinction again. Well, it's going to drop off quicker the second time, and even quicker the third, and even quicker the fourth. So just going through an extinction trial once, or series once, isn't going to completely get rid of the behavior permanently. You're going to see the resurgence or spontaneous recovery as well. Right off the bat, identify the reinforcers. If you don't know these, extinction is completely ineffective, because you have to, by definition, with all the reinforcers. Be consistent in your application. If you're not consistent, you're producing a variable interval schedule or a variable ratio schedule, and now you're just producing resistance to extinction and high rates of behavior. Add other procedures. There's no reason you can't use a punishment procedure with extinction. It's going to work really well, but don't forget to fade out that punishment procedure. Tell the person, assuming they're verbal, what you're doing. If you tell them, then and they already tend to be somebody that responds well to rules, then you're just going to increase the probability that your extinction is going to be effective. Extinction produces aggression. It produces it in multiple species, including humans. So when you put a behavior on extinction, basically you're saying, hey, what you're doing now, well, guess what? That's not going to work for you anymore. I'm not going to give you what you used to get as a result of that. Well, that tends to frustrate people. So frustration produces aggression, so on and so forth. Whatever you do, don't reinforce those aggressive behaviors. Otherwise, that's what the person's going to learn, because keep in mind, they're losing reinforcers here, so they're going to try and do anything they can to get those back. Plan for generalization, making sure that different responses are going to go on extinction, making sure you're going to do this in different settings, so on and so forth. If at all possible, make it permanent. Because if you don't make it permanent, the behavior will come back. This stuff doesn't happen in a vacuum. So when that behavior comes back, then you're going to be, in a sense, in trouble if you don't have the extinction in place. Because also some of the stuff we know about this resurgence and relearning type thing is that when that behavior comes back, if you don't have your extinction procedure in place permanently, it comes back and the person learns it quicker the second time through, so they get to a higher rate of behavior and faster as a result. So make it permanent if at all possible. Some other methods that you can use to reduce behavior, not using punishment. Right? And this is a sort of an interesting thing, because here we can reduce problem behaviors by reinforcing appropriate behaviors or reinforcing the rates of a particular behavior. So we're actually going to be able to use reinforcement to produce a decrease in behavior, which seems a little bit backwards, because reinforcement is defined as the strengthening of a response. right? So, or increasing the probability of a response. So we're actually going to go the other direction with it. We're going to increase the probability of a rate of response, or increase the probability of one response. And we're going to do that using differential reinforcement. So how do you use differential reinforcement? Well, essentially all you're doing is establishing stimulus control. Well, how do we do that? We withhold reinforcement for one behavior, okay, and then we provide reinforcement for the one we want. So, in a nutshell, withholding reinforcement, you should read that as extinction. So, extinguish one behavior, reinforce another. Put one behavior on punishment, reinforce another. So, that's how you're going to use differential reinforcement. Typically speaking, this is done with positive reinforcement, but there's no reason you couldn't use negative reinforcement. It's just typically easier to use positive reinforcement. Right. Different types of differential reinforcers here, or differential reinforcement procedure. With a DRI or a DRA, DRI is differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior. Excuse me, differential reinforcement, or DRA is differential reinforcement of alternative behavior. So think about a situation where you get two behaviors, operants, right? These two behaviors are competing with each other. The one with the most reinforcement is going to win. That's well understood. That's the matching law in general, right? In other words, it's going to be performed at a higher rate than the other. What we want to do is try to increase, and we're going to reinforce the desired behavior. So we're going to increase the one that we want. We're going to reinforce that one the most, and as a result, the other one's going to go down. Right? Well, two ways. We could differentially reinforce the incompatible behavior. So, an incompatible is the key here. So, if you got somebody that's poking, a kid in the classroom that's poking their neighbor, then think about a response that's incompatible with poking your neighbor. Well, there's a couple of them. Sitting on your hands is an obvious one, because if you're sitting on your hands and you can't poke somebody else. Another one is using your hands to do schoolwork, right? So you could reinforce the kiddo for doing math problems or drawing or something like that, where their hands are on their table, using their pencil, their pens, their crayons, whatever, right? And keeping their hands to themselves. So you can reinforce that because it's completely incompatible with them touching someone else. Right? So so how does this actually work? Well, the behavior that we don't want, let's say poking your neighbor, we're going to put that on extinction. And then at the same time, the incompatible response, we're going to produce a very high rate of reinforcement. Just slightly thinner than continuous reinforcement, because continuous is so non-resistant to extinction that we want to at least build some potential for success in here. Alternative behavior is very, DRA is very similar to DRI, except it's just any other response. It doesn't have to be non-compatible or incompatible. So, poking your neighbor, I suppose you could have one hand free, because you could still poke your neighbor and do something else with your other hand. You see what I'm getting at there? So it's any alternative behavior that you want that is not the poking. Which one's more effective? I don't know. I suppose just by definition, incompatible is more effective, but it's also harder to come up with options for the incompatible behavior one for DRI as it is for DRA. DRA is much easier to use in the sense that any behavior that is even close to desirable is the one you're going to reinforce. You don't even have to worry about it being incompatible. We can use differential reinforcement of alternative behavior for in a negative reinforcement sense. You can escape something. So we could set this up instead of positive reinforcers as escape maintained behaviors. So I will let you I will let you get away from this scenario or take an extra break or whatever, assuming you engage in an appropriate behavior and not an inappropriate one. So you could do that in a DRI or a DRA sense. How do we use it? It must be in the repertoire, right? So you can use this with a new response. So we're not going to teach somebody something new and then immediately put it on a DRA, DRI. That's not going to function very well. So because you got to get that behavior established, they have to know what to do. Right? And then ideally, we're going to reinforce the crap out of it, the behavior that you want, either the DRA or the DRI. So whichever behavior that's desirable, you're going to reinforce the heck out of it. Now, I said just a minute ago that something slightly thinner than CRF, continuous reinforcement. So continuous will work, but you're going to have to thin it eventually. So the idea is to start with CRF if you want, and then extinguish the other response, and flat out provide no reinforcers for the inappropriate response. This one's a bit weird. Some people call this DR0. It's very similar to DRA. We're going to differentially reinforce other behavior. So in other words, when a problem behavior has not occurred for a period of time, reinforce whatever is happening. So if the kiddo, this works really well with high rates of inappropriate behavior. So if you've got a kiddo that's engaging in a particular response at a high rate, and then they take a break for whatever reason, doesn't even matter why, catch them doing good or doing well and reinforce the appropriate behavior. You could do this on a fixed interval, you could do it on a variable interval, whichever one you want. All right. Again, there's a lot of scenarios where this one's difficult, and I don't want you to see this as a DR0 because that really starts to get confusing. But some people will talk about it as that, so I suppose I'll go over it. So the DR0 is basically, I'm going to reinforce you for engaging in no rates of behavior. And the problem I have with DR0 is it doesn't make sense, because in order for reinforcement to happen, then it has to be contingent upon a response. So that's why I think if you're going to use DR0, or if you're reading it, you should read it as a DRO. How do we use it? Start rich and then thin out the schedule. Again, just like the other stuff. So start out with a continuous reinforcement and thin it out. Don't reinforce any inappropriate behavior. Okay? If you're doing true DRO, then this is a pretty straightforward procedure to do. Because anytime that inappropriate behavior happens, you're just not going to provide any sort of reinforcement whatsoever. In other words, you're putting it on extinction. And of course, plan for generalization. Set this up in multiple environments. Don't just always do it during the math times or the math lessons. Do it during the social studies lessons or any other lesson as well. DRL. This is the one where you're really starting to reduce the rates of responding. You're still allowing a particular response to occur, but you're allowing it to occur at a lower rate. Think of kids being off task. In a 5th grade class, it's okay for the kids to be off task once in a while. You're not going to expect them to be on task 100% of the time, but you don't want them off task a lot. If that's the case, go ahead and use a DRL. So differentially reinforce low rates of behavior. So full session DRL. So you must achieve a particular rate for an entire session. So imagine this for an entire day. Right? So for an entire day, you're only allowed to be off task 3 times. If so, I'm going to reinforce you at the end of the day. Pretty straightforward. Interval. Divide that individual session that we talked about a moment ago into intervals. Right? Then we're going to meet a criteria for each interval. So DRL, for every 15-minute period, I will allow you to be off task once. Okay? So now you're getting reinforced basically 4 times an hour for being off task. But anything more than that, you're not going to earn the reinforcer. Okay? In order for this to happen, in order to use the interval DRL, the behavior must be at a fairly high rate to begin with, and you have to match that interval criteria to the problem. A former student and I did a particular study where she used a DRL procedure to change non-contextual vocalization. So the idea was that this kid was just making funny noises, right? So they weren't really words; they were just noises, or whatever. Right? So the kid was making these noises, and she decided to use a DRL. And her approach worked really well. The kid went from 400 NCVs a day to the first session, she went down to 9. And in the second session, she went down to 7. The third session, and there was a couple of sessions involved in each one. So with each level, that took 3 sessions, basically. So 3 sessions, which were 2-hour sessions each. She went from 400 down to 9, down to 7, down to 5, down to 4, down to 3. And then eventually we just kind of let it maintain out at 1. We attempted to kill it down to 0, but it just didn't work well. So we just kind of left it at 1, which was good enough for the teachers. So in every couple-hour period, the kid was making some random noise once, as opposed to 400 times a day. So we went basically from 400 times a day down to 4 hours a day, or 4 times a day. So that was extremely effective. Right? Well, when we think about DRLs, you can also think about pacing. In other words, I don't want you to respond too much. I want you to take your time and make only a certain number of responses over a given period. So we're establishing a pace. Okay? This is not fast. The example I described to you was fast, but it still took, let's see, still took a couple of weeks in order to get the behavior to reduce. Could we have gotten it quicker with the punishment? Yeah, sure, but we didn't want to use punishment. We just wanted to use reinforcement. In order to make this most effective, make sure you get a good baseline. If you don't get a good baseline, then you're going to run into not knowing if you're reinforcing the behavior at the appropriate rate. You can use the mean in this case of the baseline to establish your base criteria, and you can go from there. Sometimes you use it slightly less than the mean, so that way you're establishing a success early on, right? And then start to thin that schedule as I talked about. Notice we went from 9 behaviors per session to 7 behaviors to 5 behaviors to 4 to 3. We didn't just jump from 9 all the way to 2. It took us some time to break that thing down. So we gradually thinned that schedule, and we were able to get the behavior under control. There's also, instead of targeting the consequence, which is what we've been doing, we targeted the consequence with extinction, we targeted with differential reinforcement, so why not target the antecedent? That's the other part where you can really start to change behavior. Behavior that's contingency dependent, you can set up new discriminative stimuli, okay, or you can modify existing discriminative stimuli. Right? If the behavior doesn't seem to be responding to a 3-term contingency, or if you're unable to identify it, then just work with the motivating operations. Now, this one, I tend to have a little bit of an issue here because it always goes under antecedent interventions, because you're modifying you're modifying the effectiveness of the reinforcer ahead of time. But in a sense, you're really just modifying the value of the reinforcer, so it's kind of a consequence intervention as well as an antecedent intervention. But both of them work. So we can establish discriminative stimuli or just modify existing ones to select for different responses. Let me go back to that one. There's always a little more to say here. So by establishing new discriminative stimuli, I can give you an example that Karen Pryor used. Again, the lady that wrote that book, Don't Shoot the Dog. I think it was dolphins that she was working with, and her dolphins were engaging in a behavior of going to the bottom of the tank. Or there's pool, or whatever you want to call it, right? So the dolphins were swimming to the bottom of the pool, and there was no signal for them to, and it was kind of an avoidance sort of response. So she wanted to get rid of that behavior. So what she decided to do, just kind of out of the blue, which is where this really came from, was she decided to produce a new signal for the dolphins to swim to the bottom. And if they did swim to the bottom, then they got a reinforcer for it. So what happened was that she established a discriminative stimuli for the behavior that she didn't want, and then she put it on a DRL. She said, okay, you're only going to do that when I ask you to do it. And it worked like a charm. The dolphins stopped doing it at random times, and they started only doing it when they were, quote-unquote, asked to do it. Right? Modifying existing discriminative stimuli, you can remove them, you can fade them out, you can do all sorts of stuff. And all of those, again, they assume that the behavior is under stimulus control. Non-contingent reinforcement. This is one I don't really like to use. I don't know a lot of people that do like to use this, but it is a procedure that is out there. It's been well established, and it tends to work pretty well. You need to already have identified a reinforcer, and if you've identified that reinforcer, now you can deliver it on a fixed time or a variable time schedule. At this point, it does not matter what the learner is doing, because what's going to happen is that they're going to. It becomes very similar to a DRO. That basically whatever they're doing is going to get reinforced after this given amount of time has passed, or an average amount of time has passed. Those are your FTs and VTs. And hopefully you're going to catch an appropriate response during that time. And even if you don't, it really doesn't matter, because the problem behavior is not going to be getting reinforced, most likely. Right? We can also use a motivating operation and just decrease the value of the reinforcer, which is essentially what's happening with non-contingent reinforcement, because we're just giving it all the time. As you use that reinforcer, the one that's been maintaining the problem behavior, so if you start delivering that particular reinforcer, then you're going to decrease those inappropriate responses. Why? Because you're decreasing the value of that reinforcer, so the person no longer wants to work for it. Do an FBA to track those reinforcers. The value is going to change over time and match the non-contingent reinforcement to this change. In other words, as as you use the reinforcement, the value is going to be less and less, so you don't need to keep it up at that high rate. You can start to slow down that NCR. Right? Also, using the extinction with this is going to be an effective procedure. You start out with a very thick schedule and then fade the time constraints. In other words, every 5 minutes, fade it to 10 minutes, and then every 15 into 20, and so on and so forth, whether you're using a fixed time or a variable time. And that's it for that response, for that, what shall I call it? Slide chat. I will talk to you soon.